listeners,
to the
and welcome
show.
to the show that something, the Mentionables. I'm Joel Fergus.
And I'm Caleb Johnston.
Today on the Mentionables, we're talking about hell. It's going to be a hell of a show.
Very true. Very true. I couldn't have put it better myself. So, in diving in and talking about hell today, what exactly are we going to discuss, Joel?
Well, let me set this up by telling you why I think this is the topic of the day, or otherwise. So, a couple of years ago, I was interacting on a post. I think it might have been one that I made, and the post was philosophical more than it was theological. I was talking about how the internet divides us rather than unites us, or something. I don't know. Anyway, this girl that's not a friend of mine on Facebook jumps in and starts arguing, but she's not even addressing the point. She's trying to bait me on subjects theologically. Now, she wasn't a friend. I don't know how she had gotten the impression that I was the guy to talk about theology. She clearly was hostile unto it. And then, I was like, yeah, this is not what I'm talking about. I kept trying to redirect. And she's like, yeah, I looked at your page and it says you're an apologist and you're not a very good one. I was like, well, what would a good apologist be saying right about now? She'd be like, he'd be defending the concept of hell and telling me how everybody goes to hell and hellity, hell. I didn't take the bait, and it was one of those Facebook conversations where if I didn't respond within 30 seconds in the comments section, mind you, she was like, scared you away. You aren't going to. I was like, I do have a real life that extends beyond Facebook, and I'm doing things right now. And eventually I had to sever the conversation because it was time for me to put the kids to bed. And so I said, yeah, I need to leave to put my kids to bed. And she's like, yeah, make sure you teach them about how they're all damned to hell if they don't be good boys and girls. And so clearly she had a hang up with this concept of hell, right?
Right.
Well, you and I did a show where we were looking through this deconvert that I had profiled. And if you recall, his major, the trigger for him was the concept of hell. How could all these good people that just happen not to be Christian hell, and so he eventually kind of went a little liberal to sort of weed out this concept of hell that really bothered him. And more recently, one of the people I'm profiling, he met an atheist through a dating website, and he confessed that, well, I'm kind of Christian. She's like, all right, well, we could still meet up, but only if you don't believe in the concept of hell. That was her kind of line in the sand as regards Christianity. And then the most recent interview that I listened to about deconversion, this guy's talking about his journey about religion and, how he started to have doubts at some point. And the interviewer's like, hell, right? That was your doubt, was hell. So,
wow.
As it happens, it's a big deal. And I'm sure
I've noticed.
Go ahead.
I've noticed that it's a big holdup with a lot of the cults too. When they go to start altering, especially the Christian cults, as we've talked about before, Christian cults, some of the first doctrines they take and alter in some way, shape, or form usually are those doctrines of hell or eternal damnation. Like, those are one of the first things they grab, they change, they alter, they throw entirely out to make things more appealing for joining the cult, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, and I'm sure the ones I'm listing are not the only, objections of hell. It's one of the most common. I was just grabbing the ones that really stood out to me. But, so it seems fairly clear why in the modern Western mindset, hell would be so objectionable, right? Because we've kind of been taught a bit that everybody is unique and, everybody is essentially good, and, um, everybody has value and, deserves, kind of a confirmation of the value. And to a degree, we agree with that, right? Because we're all made in God's image. That's kind of
Right.
one of the foundations of morality. I have worked for most of my adult life with children that have, severe disabilities and, often cognitive disabilities that haven't allowed them to enter the level of uh, lucidity or capacity to understand things. And, there's this concept that, no matter how damaged this child is physically, they deserve the same kind of treatment and rights that the people that don't have those kinds of uh, mental handicaps do, right? So this is kind of a concept that's eked into the culture, Christian or not. We recognize that human beings are human beings, no matter how deficient. They deserve, the treatment that any other human being deserves. So,
Right.
yeah,
Unless you're Matt Dillahunty, but
I guess there's always exceptions. But at any rate, the point being that, now that we have that mindset, which I think is probably something we inherited from the Judeo-Christian philosophy that has formed Western culture, this concept that some people are going to be kind of thrown on the eternal trash heap, so to speak, is deeply offensive. Everybody is, of the same value. Now, this is not it's not a sort of an objection that you would have heard in most ancient cultures, and it's not an objection you'd hear from non-Western cultures. In fact, most cultures throughout history and geographically have had some concept of hell. Maybe not the burning lake of fire type hell, but some kind of pleasant, compartment of the afterlife for those people. You've got, even going back to Egypt, you've got this idea that, was it Horus or Osiris will weigh your heart against a feather, and if your heart is heavier than a feather, then you don't deserve the good part of the afterlife, so you kind of get the bad part.
right.
And ancient, or Egyptian culture is pretty far removed from our modern culture, and even the text of the Bible that kind of define some sort of hell concept.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, very much so.
This is kind of an objection that's sort of crept into Western culture. Does that mean we don't take it seriously? No, not at all. In fact, as I've said, I think that this value that we give to individual human beings in Western culture has been inherited by our Christian concept. So, if anything, the philosophy or theology that brought about this value is that which creates this sort of cognitive dissonance when it comes to the concept of hell.
Yeah, and I think we've taken a very much all or nothing approach these days, in that it's about, you always give a person this highest esteem in terms of their personal value, or you always deal with justice in this way. There's no real balance in what we're seeing in, I think, particularly the last 50 years, as things have changed, in terms of looking at these concepts with a balance. It's just not something I see very often in terms of how people approach these issues.
Yeah. Now, I don't have the resources to kind of give a history of the development of this concept of hell. I can say from what I have read that you don't really have a firm sort of torturous hell concept in the Old Testament that I'm aware of. There appears to be some kind of hell concept, but it's poorly defined. Um, and this idea that there's the psalm that says that you can't hide from God, and part of it says even if I were to descend into the depths of Sheol, um, and that was kind of the word for the grave, but there's this idea that you're going down into some gloomy place, um, you know, and you have the Witch of Endor kind of pulling up the prophet Samuel from the grave. Idea that there is some kind of afterlife and it's not always pleasant. Um, but then you get the sort of lake of fire imageries and the worm shall not die, and there will be gnawing and of teeth, and all this apocalyptic imagery of hell in the New Testament. And there's a good chance that apocalyptic is exactly the correct word for it, because we know that apocalyptic language in Scripture is sort of this exaggerated language used to convey some kind of meaning, often kind of a prophecy of judgment, right? Um, so there's that to take into account. But then we know that, in the more, I would say, about the time of the Great Revival, you really have this emphasis being placed on, hellfire preaching about, how terrible it would be to be judged by God. And then this is where this concept of this eternal conscious torment really gets brought out and emphasized in Christian culture. Um, and it may be that that's the time period that you really start to see this kind of fear of hell creep into the culture, because the evangelism wasn't so much about God loves you, etc. It was more about you hate your sins, etc. You know, um, not to say that you couldn't find biblical precedent for that kind of preaching, like it is a terrible thing to fall in the hands of an angry God or something like that from the book of Hebrews. Now I'm paraphrasing that. That's probably not the exact language, but you get the idea. So
Right.
that's my really brief thumbnail sketch of what I know of the history of how we've kind of graduated concept of hell that we currently have. Anything to add to that?
Um, I know too that a lot of the contemporary imagery we see actually came from, much later development. So even though some of these concepts were present and developed within doctrine, a lot of the imagery we think of for hell came a lot in the Middle Ages, if I'm correct, with Dante's Inferno and Paradise Lost helped develop a lot of these things into kind of the contemporary visual, hellfire and brimstone and the devil with his pointy tail and all this stuff that listeners may kind of connect when they hear the word hell. And then I think probably even more recently, we get the idea that the hell is ruled by the devil, and this is a place where he's happy and tormenting other people, and kind of the bad place to go because the devil and his demons rule there and rain down destruction and torture on everybody else. I think from a biblical standpoint, we see it being one place where it's very, very clear is that this is not a good thing for the fallen angels. This is a bad place for them for sure.
Yeah, and you see that kind of language where Jesus cast out Legion, and they tell him not to send them into the pit, which is very offhanded comment, and not extrapolated upon at all in that passage. But Revelation, I believe it is, that it talks about how this is a place of outer darkness where that God prepared for the devil and his angels, or something like that. And I think there's a section where it talks about how the dragon is unchained and, kind of loosed upon the world, or something like that in Revelation. Again, I'm just pulling these from memory, so don't quote me on any of that, but something of that does exist within Scripture. I
Right.
point out because the Middle Ages really were a time period that hell was emphasized. So I was wrong when I said it started happening at the Great Revival. It didn't. It started in the Middle Ages, and you have literature about it, and you have a lot of really graphic paintings and art about it in that time period. So yeah, I mean it's been a big concept in Christian culture for quite a while when you take that into account.
Yeah, you just made that trilogy of paintings come to mind now. I can't remember the artist. I was just looking at it the other day though. Very very interesting looking at some of the art of that period, and it certainly invokes some pretty horrific imagery and thought processes as to hell when you really incorporate some of this art you see back then.
Well, at that point, um, I think before we sort of launch into the defenses of hell, it would be worthwhile taking a look at some of the, various concepts of hell that have developed over the years. Um, of course, your classic is the eternal conscious torment. I'd like to get to that last because I want to look at some. Hold on, I've got somebody coming into the room. Maybe you just going potty. Okay. Anyways, I'd like to kind
Fair
of
enough.
save the eternal conscious torment for last. There have been ideas of hell that I don't know whether or not they've been developed sort of to soften the blow by modern apologists, or how long they've been kind of in circulation. Of course, the one that you hear most frequently, or the one I hear most frequently, is that it's more or less this kind of separation from God, and that bring it upon yourself when you reject God. Why would God take you to a place that you didn't want to be in the first place? And so there's kind of this outer darkness concept, and it's unpleasant because God being the foundation of all things good, being absent in that area makes it unpleasant because all good things are absent at that point. So, and you get a similar concept in C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. You know, he makes hell just kind of this giant nothing. I don't know. Have you read Great Divorce?
I have. It's been a while though. But yeah, it was definitely a much different approach than you usually see.
Yeah, he has hell being this sort of nebulous place where things are kind of vague and unreal because, again, you're kind of retreating from the, essential reality represented by God. And by contrast, heaven was so real that every blade of grass had its own, you know, strength to it. It would not bend and would stick. He just kind of gave this imagery of just the pure reality of heaven versus hell, which is kind of this vague place. And I think he was the one that said the gates of hell are locked from the inside. As these people are in rebellion against God and they don't want any part to do with God. And so in his hell, people
Right.
are just kind of really spread apart and they're sort of living in their own little world and developing their own little philosophies to try to kind of justify where they are now away from God and all kinds of things like that. So it isn't so much hellish as it is just kind of, you know, putting yourself in a condition of vagueness, or unreality. So that was
Right.
that was
People, if
his.
I remember, people were, so still set in their ways, and it had reached a point where, everyone who was there was so set in their ways they couldn't kind of see the bigger picture as to the the hell, if you will, that they had put themselves in.
Mhm. Yeah. So, again, this is a softer version than the eternal conscious torment, burning in a lake of fire and so forth, simply because, it's kind of something you brought upon yourself. And it's this whole idea that, if you didn't like the concept of God, you're away from the concept of God. And so, it's not as bad, or so one would think. Um,
Right.
yeah. And then the other one that's kind of gaining ground in recent years. It's been around for quite a while, but it's getting a lot of traction recently. And I can't escape the possibility that it's gaining traction because it sort of softens the blow once again. But that's annihilationism.
True.
You're familiar? Okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
annihilation.
yeah, very, very familiar. Particularly since I work a lot with Jehovah's Witnesses, they they accept annihilationism as their view for hell, if you will. Although they completely throw out the concept and say annihilationism is it. So, in a nutshell, annihilationism is kind of the wastebasket idea. Instead of a conscious torment, there's just a lack of existence for people once they die. If they don't accept the belief, then that's it. They're gone, and it's very much like the atheistic view of eternity, and that there is none.
Yeah, your soul just kind of disappears,
Right.
and you cease to exist. You know, and honestly, this would appeal to sort of Eastern religions, which kind of think of the cycle of rebirth as something unpleasant because your karma is what keeps sending you back, and you have to constantly work off the bad karma. And nirvana, in the Buddhist sense, really is sort of the elimination of the soul. You have, cut the cycle, and achieve sort of this cosmic nothingness where you no longer recycle back into harsh reality. And then, of course, atheists kind of expect it anyway. You go into nothing, you cease to exist. And, so in a sense, annihilationism is a lot less objectionable simply because it's kind of what the various philosophies are working toward anyway.
Right, and it's one of the first things Jehovah's Witnesses will throw at people when they're having conversations, particularly with Christians. One of the first things they will always throw at me in discussions is, "Oh, you believe in hell? You believe in hell? What a terrible concept that is. How a real loving God would never do that. We believe that people are just gone when it's over with, and it's one of the first things they'll throw out there against Christians in particular.
Yeah. So yeah, there's annihilationism, and then there's sort of the Rob Bell love wins kind of up to where I've never read the book, so I don't want to put words in his mouth, but generally this universal concept where either hell's just not a thing, everybody sort of achieves union with God, and all roads lead to the same destination sort of thing, or at worst, hell is kind of a place of reform where you go and you just kind of learn, you know, to dislike the bad parts of you and to love God, and you just kind of transition into the greatness of it. And so it's not terribly unpleasant. You're just kind of, it's kind of a purgatory kind of thing where you're just sort of suspended there as you learn to love God, um and then you enter into union with God just like everybody else. So yeah.
Yeah, a lot of Christian universalists, and even veering some into New Thought, kind of lean that way with a lot of things.
Yeah. So yeah, those, and then before we get into eternal conscious torment, do you know any other models that I've missed?
Let's see. Trying to think if anything else is coming to mind. There's some variances to all these to a certain degree, but none that greatly kind of differ. Did we touch at all on um, kind of the outer darkness view, that hell is uh, maybe not so much a separate destination from heaven, but is still being distant from God in terms of presence, location, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's what I meant when I was talking about sort of the C.S. Lewis type view, where it's separation from God, sort of separation from all things good type thing. That's what I was intending to talk about. Anything to add
Okay.
to that?
No, I think that just brings up the point that you could take any of these views and kind of alter a little bit, and so when you encounter Christians, you may find people who have some kind of variance in these views. I think these views all capture kind of the major uh, trains of thought, but there may be variance in terms of how that plays out theologically and exactly how people come to an understanding of this. But I think in general, we've captured kind of the major views,
All right.
at
So
least
eternal
the
conscious torment.
orthodox ones.
Okay. Yeah. So this is, the understanding that people more or less have of hell, where, um, so biblical passage that kind of lead up to that is you have, this parable of Lazarus and the rich man, where the rich man is on the other side of this kind of chasm, and he's in a very unpleasant place where he's parched. And I don't remember the exact description of the place, but definitely it was unpleasant for him. And he's talking about, if just a drop of uh, water on his lips would be enough to kind of ease some of the torment that he's feeling. And, he asks first to go back to his brothers and, tell them about this horrible fate that awaits them, and so on and so forth. So that paints a pretty unpleasant picture of the afterlife for the unredeemed. And then you have the lake of fire imagery, which I don't know where that comes from, so I couldn't tell you more than just the name. It's in the Bible somewhere, but and then you have this idea of being cast into the outer darkness. This comes from another parable that Jesus about the wedding feast, right? And so he invites all of these people to the wedding feast of his son, and in the parable, I think this was meant to talk about the religious leaders of the time, and they all give an excuse why they can't come. And so he sends out the servants into the highways and byways and gets the crippled and the poor and the elderly and everybody else to come fill in the feast. And then all the people that come, it says they get cast into, he tells the servants, cast them into the outer darkness where there is weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. Now, again, this idea of outer
That
darkness.
sounds like bedtime at my house.
So this outer darkness could be representative of this idea of separation from God, but this whole idea of weeping and wailing and gnashing teeth has more of a internal conscious torment flavor to it.
Right.
And then, of course, about how the Legion didn't want to be sent to the pit because presumably that was not a good place to be, and how God created this area for Satan and his angels, and he's sending these unredeemed. And you have this parable of the wheat and the tares that Jesus tells about how this person harvests his crop, and he's got wheat and he's got weeds, and so he goes through and he throws the weeds into a furnace and he keeps the wheat. And of course the parable was intended to mean those which God accepts and those which God rejects, um, in that respect. And there's that furnace imagery right there again of them being burned.
Right.
So this idea of fire and unpleasantness for those who do not accept God is pretty ubiquitous throughout the New Testament. A lot of it we get from the parables of Jesus, and so that raises a question right there of how literally were we meant to take, because they were in fact parables. So and this is something that some scholars use to kind of bring some doubt upon this question. But some, and some of it we get from Revelation, which again is filled with apocalyptic imagery and so forth. So that is one of the things that casts some doubt upon this concept, only because you get it a lot less in the more theological writings of, say, Paul, and more in the apocalyptic and parable writings. So there's that. But yeah, I mean, this essential view that the human soul was created as something that was by default immortal, This human soul cannot be quenched or destroyed unless you're an annihilationist. And so there are those who have been redeemed and go to live with God, which is very pleasant. Those who God rejects and sends to this place where they are in torment all the time, but they can never die. Um, so yeah, that's my general take on this kind of classic hellfire view of eternal conscious torment. You want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's a good summary, and I think that's one of the ones you will most encounter within fundamentalist churches. Um, Certainly, Baptist churches. You hear a lot of the hellfire and brimstone kind of preaching. And I think it's the one that has kind of caught uh, the secular eye, if you will, in terms of that's the view that is kind of highest held in terms of this is what all Christians believe. It's this view of hell that is the most widespread and the one that is people I think even believe is the most accurate for Christendom.
All right. Yeah. And I mean, getting back to my deconversion studies just a moment, this I think this objection looms large because of what you're talking about, this kind of sort of drifting to the more fundamentalist Baptist type idea where this is something that is preached and it's something that's really held, high on the um, spectrum of ideas that is really, really important. And I think to an extent, that's this, it's this concept that drives evangelism. There's this firm desire to evangelize and become, bring people into the fold, if you will. And so this is a high motivation to do so. But again, it's also a motivation to, remain pure and act right. And especially under this concept that all good boys and girls go to heaven and bad boys and girls go to hell. Now, I say all of that to say this. In these deconversion stories that I review, there is this moment as they're starting to doubt and they're starting to drift away that they start to consider, well, what if I go to hell? And there's this real kind of horror and fear and everything that they feel, which is possibly, one of the drivers of hell being such an objectionable concept is because, as they go away from Christianity, they have to hold into account this one possibility that they might be wrong. What's the penalty for being wrong? And you also have the idea of Occam's razor, right? So I don't know how much Occam sort of emphasized this idea of hell, but presumably it sort of hovered there as, one of the disadvantages on the con side, if you will.
You mean Pascal's wager?
Yeah, Pascal. What did I say? Occam's.
You said Occam's razor.
Sorry, that's a little bit of my own philosophy creeping in there.
Oh yeah, I know you kind of tie the two together. So
for other reasons,
makes sense to mix them. Right, exactly.
But yeah, Pascal's wager. It figures on the con side that, what if you're wrong?
And I think it's interesting from looking at the wager, just to sidetrack for a minute. But in terms of the views of hell of most major world religions, a lot have concepts that deal with good deeds and being a good person to avoid their hell concepts or the negative outcomes in the afterlife. And really, one of the objections to Pascal's wager is always that well, you've got so many thousands of religious views, which one do you take at this point? It's pointless to make the wager because you've got so many different views. But really, when you boil down the views of hell, which ones actually have concepts of hell that are existent within them and that some people are going to be damned to, you really only have Islam and Christianity that hold up for consideration in terms of things that are decisions outside of being a good person. Um, in Islam, Allah's going to choose who he wants, and if he's having a bad day, you're going to hell anyway. With Christianity, you can actually uh, theoretically make the decision to accept Christ and to avoid hell. You have that option there in Christianity, as opposed to Islam, which you can do some things that may please him along the way, but still, if he hits a bad day. So anyway, point being, with Pascal's wager, there is actual reasonable grounds, I think, to narrow that down to certain religions. And if you look at it in the scope of, well, here are the religions, here are the things that influence positive or negative outcomes in the afterlife. There are reasons to consider Christianity as the primary religion you would look at if you were taking a purely probabilistic approach to the afterlife.
Yeah. So now that we've reviewed the various concepts of hell, do you want to cue me which one you favor?
Well, I'll be honest. I think that from a philosophical standpoint, I lean towards annihilationism because I think from a philosophical standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. I think from a biblical standpoint, I do lean more towards eternal conscious torment or outer darkness type concepts. I think they hold up relatively well biblically. So you could say I'm undecided. What I do know from all this, though, is that any of these concepts are something I would want to avoid, even annihilationism. I think at the very least there would be a conscious awareness of what you've missed out on prior to the elimination of your consciousness. So I think that it's certainly not something good or that anyone would want to experience, regardless of which of these it is. So I haven't quite reconciled my philosophical and logical approach to the problem with my biblical approach to it yet. But that's kind of my take in a nutshell.
So hell is one of the many things that I don't take a strong stand on, only because I haven't studied it to the degree that I would need to be satisfied of my view. But it is something that
Right there with you.
uh, that obviously exists. It's a concept that exists and that has to be dealt with. So, based on what considerations I've had and what Bible I've read, I tend toward a version, I suppose, of eternal conscious torment, and I'll explain. I have a difficult time accepting the separation from God concept, only in that, this seems to denigrate to some degree the, aspects of God that we know, which is the omnipresence. How could God truly be absent anywhere in the universe or anywhere in, I don't know, some kind of reality, and it still be a reality? And, you
Right.
get this in the Psalms. Again, I mentioned this before, that he says, even if I were to descend into the depths of Sheol, you are with me there. And I mean, I'm certain that the psalm to to convey some other kind of concept than simply hell. But even so, it does kind of highlight this idea that the omnipresence of God is one of the essential aspects of God and is not something that could be escaped, um, on my understanding of omnipresence. So
Right.
that's one of the reasons that I tend against this separation concept is, I mean, if we assume that which sustains all existence, then separation would essentially be annihilation. You know, being separated from the base of all, the grounding of all reality is the same as not existing. Um, so there's that.
True.
Um, I don't have a firm uh, refutation of annihilationism. I've read some of the material about it, and it seems to be just kind of another scriptures that we, already look at when we're considering the idea of hell. And so, it's hard for me to refute something I haven't really looked into the arguments for. However, there are a couple of things that strike me as I'm reading scripture in this respect. And that one of them is this okay. There is this very present misunderstanding in Christianity about the quote afterlife. And that is this concept that, we die, we go to some airy other spiritual dimension called heaven, and then end of story. There it is. But that's not the picture we see in Scripture. Throughout Scripture, Old and New Testament, we have this concept of some future point at which the Messiah, and there is this general resurrection of the dead. And, and then after that, there's this sort of recreation of a heaven and earth, sort of this new heaven, new earth, which is sort of a protected, a perfected creation, and that's what lasts for eternity. So it's not, this idea that there's just a spiritual dimension and that's the end of the story isn't consistent from what because we see a resurrection. We look forward to a future resurrection, and this is a concept that seems to be held in tension with one another within a lot of Christian ideas, because I think every Christian kind of has this idea that God's going to come back and resurrect us, but at the same time they have this idea that we die and we go to heaven and end of story. So I don't think many Christians actually bring those two together and realize that there's more to the story than just dying and going to heaven.
Right.
So you have this idea of a general resurrection, and I don't have the passage for it, but there is a passage that clearly says that, everybody's resurrected. It's not just the Christians. It's
Right.
all people, and then they're judged at that point. But presumably, if they have been resurrected, they're judged in sort of a physical body. And so, at that point, what happens? It could be that, hey, everybody's resurrected, the new heaven and new earth are created, let's get these bad guys out of here, and then they get sent to hell. So, and I don't think that that's very consistent. Presumably they would continue to live along with those people who were quote unquote saved. So Nick sent this article as we were discussing having this podcast, and I read the article. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to jump in, that verse you were mentioning there for listeners is Acts 24:15, and I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked.
Go. So yeah, thank you for looking that up. See, I wasn't just making that up. That's actually in the Bible. And so Nick's article, when I read it, it matched up with a lot of the conclusions that I had come to. And when I say conclusions, I meant hypotheses. theories based on the
Right.
reading that I could back up with the Bible verses that I knew about it. And that is this concept that the afterlife, which it's hard for me to say that because it's just continued life after resurrection, is eternal dwelling within the presence of God. You know, so everybody is present. They are present in the full presence of God. Now, what does that mean? So at this point, I'll bring you back to something we discussed in a previous episode. There's this section in the book of Exodus where they get to Mount Sinai and they're God, and there's sort of this earthquake and there's fire burning in the mountain and there's this unbearable light shining down upon them. And then he speaks and this voice is shaking the mountains and the earth. And, it's more than they can handle. And so they just beg and plead, Moses, go up the mountain and talk to God. We can't stand this. And
Right.
so this is brought up again at the end of Deuteronomy as Moses is sort of giving his swan song, and he reminds them of when they Sinai and how they begged that there would be an intercessor between them and the full presence of God, because it's just this really overwhelming, unbearable thing. And so you have this concept, and again, it's echoed throughout the Old Testament, this concept that to be in the full presence of God is a horrible thing. And, you see this, I think it might have been present in the story you were talking about where the angel of the Lord came down and, uh, somebody said, uh, I have seen God and I didn't die, and that was a big
Yeah, yeah.
surprise.
Samson's parents in Judges
Yeah.
13, they make the exclamation, "We've
Yeah.
seen God. Surely we're going to die."
Yeah. And
And
then
you see that when this angel of the Lord shows up.
Yeah, and then you see this in also in Isaiah when he's sort of receiving his commission from God. He says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne in the temple." And he sees that and he falls down on his face, trying to hide his face from the presence of God. And he says, "Woe is me, for I am an unclean man from a people of unclean lips." And that whole thing. And then
Mm-hmm.
the coal is placed upon his lips and they burn his lips, and at that point they're purified. So this is a very ubiquitous concept throughout the Old Testament, that to be in the presence of God is sort of this overwhelming and sort of horrifying thing, just because God is God and we are imperfect. And so, this is the theory or the hypothesis that I have in regards to the afterlife, is that everyone exists within the full presence of God. And there are those like Isaiah who have been purified and can therefore stand in the presence of God without the, you know, overwhelming horror that comes with that, because they've been purified and therefore they can stand to be in God's presence. And then there are those who've not been purified, and they face kind of the same situation that the children of Israel did at Mount Sinai, where they're just being overwhelmed with such a, magnificent presence, if you will, and they don't have the capacity within their physical nature to stand that. And so
Right.
this has been my concept of hell. I don't have details. My overall theory is that it is the situation wherein everyone is in the full presence of God. And your level of comfort being in the full presence of God really depends on your relationship with God prior to the resurrection. So,
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of looking at it scripturally. Um, and I think we see that play out kind of in terms of a good parallel for that is uh, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into the fiery furnace. If that was a representation in any sense of what is to come, then they have a fourth figure in there with them who appears to be the angel of the Lord, or as we discussed in that episode, the angel of the Lord appears to be Jesus in terms of his pre-incarnate appearance. And so and as Christians, we believe he is our intercessor. So to be purified through his sacrifice and to accept him is to accept that he is there to intercede with the Father and to, in a sense, purify you, because you can't purify yourself in any way. There's no way to balance the scales of justice for what you've done. Um, and Jesus does that through his sacrifice. And so I think that to consider, and I think one has to wonder, what is the ultimate outcome of that if you are in the presence of God and you don't have an intercessor? It makes sense to almost tie annihilationism into this, because how long could someone survive in the presence of God, given no intercessor, no protection for his glory and holiness? And if your your sins have not been paid for or interceded for in any way, then how long can you stand in that presence?
Yeah. So there's also this concept that's very, equally present in pretty much every one of these passages that could be used to get some kind of concept of hell, and that's the concept of separation. You have the wheat and the tare, sheep and the goats. You have the, throne where he says, "Depart from me," and you have the wedding feast versus the outer darkness. This
Mm-hmm.
concept of separation. So one would have to conclude from that there must be some well, and then yeah, Lazarus and the rich man too. There's this gulf he describes fixed between them that he can't cross over. So that language is present enough in there that one would have to kind of accept that in addition to everyone being resurrected and everyone being in the full presence of God, that everyone is not in the same physical location. I don't know what to make of that. I really don't. And again, I haven't really studied the concept of hell to be able to defend my view robustly.
Right.
So I'm willing to look at and accept other arguments at this point. One that seems to be the most defensible to me based on what I've read.
And I think that's fair, and I think that's something that's greatly missed today in general, is that these views do take a lot of reading and a lot of study to really understand and be able to grasp this concept in particular in a way that makes sense, and it comes with your whole theology attached to it, because uh, some views won't make sense if you hold to a certain theological position, and others will fit quite nicely. So I think it comes down to really understanding and trying to read what the Bible actually says about this concept, and how that matches up with a good theological understanding of who God is. Because if you leave those kind of things out, then you may end up with a view that eventually you can't reconcile with your belief in God. And I think that's what happens to a lot of people, is their theology goes one direction, and these other concepts that are there go a completely different direction. And when that gap between the two is too much, it snaps.
Yeah, so now that we've discussed the various models, if you will, of hell, let's take a look at the objection as it stands. So, again, this is a very strong objection, at least in a lot of cases I've seen. So,
Right.
anecdotally, can say that it's it's up there with the primary objections, and in some degree, it falls into this problem of evil, in the same flavor as why would God command genocide, and why would God flood the world, and all of these things? Why would God X when X equals something extremely judgmental and punishing and unpleasant? Um, yeah, and hell exists as another thing in that particular category, and since it's kind of a concept that sort of flows into the New Testament and is contemporary with Jesus himself, and if we kind of do as many do and just kind of sweep aside the whole Old Testament to get rid of all those problems and focus on the New Testament, the New Testament has this giant elephant in the room, and that being the concept of hell. And
Mm-hmm.
so, ultimately it's this of, well, if God is love, how could a God that is loving, send everyone that doesn't believe in him or hasn't gotten the chance to hear about him or is a good person otherwise, except for the fact that they're not into the whole religion thing, or, my great aunt Susie was had a heart of gold and was very nice to everyone, but she wasn't religious, and therefore she's suffering in hellfire forever. Uh, kind of. And so, the love of God is called into place. And it's just kind of this idea that I could not believe in a God that would do something like that to otherwise innocent people. Um, and then, that extends further into, hey, you're a Christian, and yet you accept this concept that most people that are going to die and then suffer the ultimate eternally, and you're cool with that. That doesn't bother you. So, I mean, in a nutshell, that's my best summary of the objection.
I think that's a good summary.
Okay, that's fair. All right, so now that we've done that, what's the apologetic defense there?
Well, for me personally, I think you have to look at God's nature first. And if God is both all loving and all just, you have to be able to reconcile those two things. It's not a either or. It's not that he's either loving or he's just. It's that he's both loving and he's just. So that means that the sins of this life cannot go without justice. And it means that the individuals are not going to go without love. So for me, what it came down to was seeing that there has to be, in order to reconcile those two concepts, the bottom line is, regardless of what the just punishment is, which you could argue that, to sin against a all-powerful being is going to have eternal consequences to any individual who does that. So the argument could be made, but regardless of what the punishment is, whether it's separation, annihilation, any of these approaches to things, if God is both just and loving, then he's going to have a consequence for evil, and he's going to offer a way out. And if a way out is offered, then he has been loving. And that way out, as Christians understand it, is the gospel. That is Jesus's sacrifice that has offered a bridge, and it's the fire escape, if you will, to this whole problem. Is if there has been a way offered out and it is completely free for those who accept it, then God's justice and his love are reconciled because he's given a way out. I think to have Jesus there is the answer to this problem of hell, because it reconciles God's justice and his love.
Okay. So there's a number of ways to question. The first I'll go after is the logical problem of hell, if you will, which is the same as the logical
Right.
problem of evil. And that is that, first of all, the objection itself doesn't really support the conclusion that therefore God does not exist.
Yeah, exactly.
Because this is another one of these unpleasant, therefore untrue type of objections. I don't like the conclusion, and therefore I don't believe the conclusion. Isn't a robust reason to reject a concept. Perhaps I don't believe that I will die because that seems unpleasant to me. So the fact that something is unpleasant doesn't warrant the conclusion that is therefore untrue. So there's that. And then, we know, and, yeah, there's a verse in it's Exodus again, and it talks about God, and it says that God is, you know, a merciful God and long suffering and forgiving of the sins of the people to the third and fourth generation. And then it follows that by God will no means clear the wicked and, is righteous and judging. Again, that's a paraphrase, but it's a very interesting verse in that it seems self-contradictory. It talks about
Right.
how God is long suffering and merciful and all of these good things. And then it talks about how God is just and will not clear the wicked and will execute perfect justice. And how do you reconcile those two things? And so, this idea that you boil down God's nature to God is love and then full stop, period, is not reflective of what you see in the Bible. And I don't think that anybody would argue that it is, which is why people tend to throw out large chunks of the Bible if they support this concept that, God is love, because you can't read the Bible and come away with the conclusion that God is sort of a one-dimensional being that is sort of all love all the time about everything. He's just a big heart in the sky, type thing. So you have to take the one with the other, and it seems like a contradiction. How could God be completely perfectly just, such that no bad deed goes unpunished, and also be forgiving and merciful and long suffering, which seem counter to perfect justice? Well, the answer to that we see is in the person of Christ. So Christ comes and he takes upon himself the justice so that he provides within God's nature the capacity to be forgiving. In other words, God's nature does not then contradict itself because God provided a method to, satisfy those two aspects of his nature. But then, Christ comes the first time as a suffering Messiah. He comes the second time as a righteous judge. And then there's, what do we do with the time in between of that? So what I'm getting at here is that it seems to me that hell is simply a logical outcome of a perfect creator God. I'm not sure how you could argue a perfect creator God and come away with the concept that there is no sort of judgment or condemnation for that which is imperfect in his presence. And I mean, this is recognized from the beginning of the Old Testament. The angel of God tells Moses to take off his presence. There's this idea that, a priest must fully cleanse himself and have no skin blemish, no imperfection, have perfectly clean clothes to come into the holiest place in the temple, because one must be completely pure in the presence of God. And they allowed for the possibility that the priest would not be perfectly pure in God's presence, and they put a rope on his foot to kind of pull him out if he died because of some imperfection in the presence of a perfect God.
Right.
This God as being a pure light, a burning fire, and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, I mean, it seems to me that this concept of some kind of bad result of being in the presence of a perfect God and yourself being imperfect is a logical conclusion if one allows for a perfect God. And so then what about this idea that, my interest, my comfort are primary in God's mind, or should be primary in God's mind, or God is himself a unworthy concept to, buy into. Again, this kind of comes up against this sort of creator versus intruder dilemma that I frequently bring up. That either God is the creator and therefore his interests are primary because he pre-existed everything, and everything that does exist has some origin within God, such that everything kind of flows back to God in his nature. And therefore, his interests are primary. He is the reason that everything exists. And so everything exists for some reason that relates to him. And therefore, this idea that my interests are primary and when I suffer, it kind of reflects poorly upon God doesn't take into account this idea God might just be the creator. Uh, the other, alternative is that God is an intruder. And God as an intruder kind of, I want, I'll say it flows out of an evolutionary concept, but this is not me attacking evolution as a concept. What it
Right.
is this idea that we can somehow come up with a concept of how everything got here without invoking a God. And if
Hmm.
we're able to do, we can come up with this idea of how life and the universe got here, and that it needed no God in order to bring it about. Then God, if he exists, is simply an intruder upon territory that he didn't, he has no right being upon. He wasn't involved in its origin, and he wasn't involved in my origin, and I create my own purpose. So if God kind of elbows himself into my world, he is doing so as an intruder, my guest, and therefore, he must abide by my rules. And if he doesn't, then I don't accept him. Uh, so yeah, creator has to kind of put God at primary. And again, you fall against this unpleasant, therefore untrue. Um, or, God is the creator, and unpleasant as it might be, his, interests are primary. And therefore, I could choose to discard because the, possibility of God has bad consequences upon me. But that is not to say that, my dislike of the concept of hell is therefore proof against the existence of God.
Right. I think that makes sense. And I think it's something that people should be willing to, at the very least, consider that these concepts may not be in conflict as much as their preconceptions about them may make it seem.
Yeah. So I mean, again, the like so many things in the atheist grab bag, the power of this argument is the emotional aspect of the argument. It's
Hmm.
very unpleasant to contemplate. It's saddening, angering, frightful, and because it invokes so many of these emotions, one would prefer a worldview that did not invoke that discomfort.
Right. And I'm sure, given how prevalent this is as an issue, this won't be the last time we'll cover it in some way, shape, or form. We've covered elements of it before, and I'm sure we'll cover a lot of it again because, like you said, the power lies in the emotion behind it.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting to me that this is such a primary argument. So, like, for instance, take the woman that said, I won't meet up with you. I won't have anything to do with you if you believe in the concept of hell. Well, I mean, if you don't believe in the concept of hell, it shouldn't have any kind of threat to you at all. It's just
Hmm.
something that some people believe that's, you know, their own little delusion. Are frightened of hell, there's, a way that one can easily escape the consequences of hell. So it doesn't, I would not take, again, I've already given the logical argument against this objection. Um, and so, either hell exists or it doesn't. If you do not believe that hell exists, why be so
Whoa, we're losing you there just a little bit, Joel.
Hell is
That was really weird, whatever your mic did just there. But could you repeat that for us? Let's see if we can hear you any better this go around. Joel is frozen, and he is gone. We didn't get to hear his final thoughts there, but I think listeners have hopefully got the gist of things. And we've been able to cover things at least to an extent that will make people a little more comfortable with exploring this concept. I'm sure that it does not answer every question or concern you'll have. This was not meant to be exhaustive at all. But hopefully we've at least given you some roads to follow in terms of whether you're a believer or a non-believer in terms of looking at this. Let's see if Joel's back and can give us his. You're back.
my connection's not great, so I can't promise I'll be on for very long. Yeah.
All right.
So the problem of hell. Yeah, I don't think that we're ever going to get past it.
Oh boy, we're hearing like robotic Joel half Terminator version in a time warp at this point. It sounds like. I'm going to try and remove you and bring you back on. Let's see if that works. Yeah, that's not working at all. He's long gone. So we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. So hopefully we covered everything. At least give you some paths to explore. We haven't, by all means, addressed all the roads you can with this, but we both believe that Jesus is certainly an answer to this problem in a lot of ways. And let's see, here we go. One last try for him to give final thoughts. Nope, he's gone. All right. Well, listeners, we hope you've enjoyed it, and keep on listening and keep on mentioning.